Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Jimmy Sexton and how he is one of the biggest power players in college football. He has been for quite some time, but as we get into this new era with a lot of changes coming, he's definitely a name that everyone should know. So, broke him down a little bit, but let's get into Texas, and let's talk about, are they ready for the SEC? This is a question that we asked with Oklahoma last week. It's a little bit of a precarious question to be asking around Oklahoma right now. Definitely a lot of questions going into 2024, but I feel pretty confident that Brett Venables and that staff can get everything where it needs to be going forward in the SEC. But let's talk about Texas here for a second, because they are a team that, when you look at the college football landscape right now, when you look at the teams that are up at the top, the teams that have every chance to make big-time noise this upcoming year, Texas is right there. When you try, it's pretty much Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, Oregon. Those are the four teams that I've kind of set in their own little category going into this year as teams that are going to be really, really hard to beat and definitely are championship favorites. So Texas is right there. There's no two ways about that. They're coming off a great year where you went to a playoff. You won a Big 12 title. You got 12 wins for the first time since 2009. So a lot of things happened at Texas last year that hadn't happened in far too long if you were to ask a Texas fan. But at the end of the day, being back for Texas, quote unquote, the joke that everyone has made throughout this time, and well-founded joke most of the time, but it was never about, making it back 1 year. It was never about, making it to the playoff and saying, wow, that was really fun, we're back in the conversation, and dust your hands and call it a day. It was always about the following year. It was always about, following that up and saying, it wasn't just a mirage last year. It wasn't just the stars aligning perfectly with Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy being incredible and some of the wide receiver group being as good as it was. All of that stuff, it wasn't a mirage. It was just, signs of what's to come. That is what this year is about. And I think when you get into the SEC, there's a lot of question marks. They are a team that can kick the door down. They are a team that can totally take over this conference and be right up there with Georgia when we talk about who is the class of the SEC. And there are a number of reasons for that. So let's start with kind of the positives around Texas, and there are a number of them. But then let's get to the worries that I have about this team. So the roster itself is one of the best in the country. There's no two ways about that. When Steve Sarkisian came into this program, they had 7 offensive linemen on scholarship on that team. That's not nearly enough. Now they're up to about 18. They've totally flipped that roster on its head. It is a much more complete, much deeper, much tougher, more SEC-ready roster than it ever has been before. Also, the infrastructure at Texas is as good as it is around the country. When you talk about this sport, it's changed so much, and the NIL and the transfer portal era have hurt a lot of big-time schools where it's not necessarily moving in the direction of your school when you have to fork over a ton of cash, when you have to, lure guys in the transfer portal to your school and to your city. It doesn't necessarily work as well for some schools. Now, for Texas, it works out perfectly. Texas has about as deep as pockets as anyone in the entire country, and you have Austin to pitch to some older guys that, it's a great city to live in. So it's one of those things where the game has moved away from other people, but it's moved exactly in the direction of Steve Sarkisian and the Texas Longhorns. And then you have recruiting, one of the best recruiting staffs in the entire country. and one of the best pitches in the entire country, especially after the playoff run. They've had top 5 classes the past 3 years, and they're shaping up to have another one this year with some remarkable wide receiver talent that we'll definitely get to into the next probably month or so as we unpack recruiting more. But the head coach, it feels like the last 2 times Texas has missed the mark. Charlie Strong and Tom Herman were not the guys to lead Texas back to the promised land, lead them back to where they want to be. It feels like that guy, Steve Sarkisian, is the one to do that. He has answered every single question that has been asked of him. When he walked in, there were some bumps. There's no two ways about that. That first season was a little bit off the walls. I'll be the first one to say that. But at the end of the day, he answered the bell. He has only improved since he's gotten there and has done really everything near perfectly since he's gotten to Texas. So it's been really remarkable to watch that turnaround. And then you have alignment, which is something that might be a little bit overlooked in the college football world. But when you have your college football head coach, you have your AD, and you have your president all on the same page about what you want to be as a program, the way you want to go about things in NIL, all of that stuff, you're pretty much unstoppable. It is a hugely important thing to college football, and it's something that hasn't happened at other schools and definitely has impeded their ability to get NIL and all of those things up to where they need to be to compete at a high level. So Texas has a lot of things going for them. There's no two ways about that. They have an incredible infrastructure, an incredible roster, a really good head coach in Steve Sarkisian, and you got to feel really good if you're a Texas fan going into this season. But I do have my worries, and they're a little bit abstract. I will say that. A lot of them aren't necessarily concrete ideas, because the reality is a lot of the concrete things you see at Texas are really good. If you look at it on paper, they are a national championship contender, and there's no question about it. Here's where my worry starts to kind of kick in, where this is the year, right? We talked about it earlier. This is the year where Texas doesn't just become a team that popped up. They become a team that is going to stick around for a while and that is going to be a player in the SEC and is going to be in the playoff most year and is going to compete for national titles and possibly win a couple in the coming years. So it's one of those things where last year they felt like a MLB player getting out of a slump, and they got a couple of hits. They're hitting the ball well, they're seeing the ball a little bit better. This year is when you start hitting bombs and you start going back to your normal ways. You start having those seasons that you're used to as an MLB player. So it's kind of like this is the coronation. This is the moment where Texas doesn't just become a team that had gotten back into the conversation, but a team that's going to stick around for a while there. And I think there's a lot of things that go into that. And the biggest thing is a lot of pressure. And especially when you're at Texas, there's a little bit added pressure. So someone like Quinn Ewers is under the immense amount of pressure of having to deliver, especially being a third-year starter, a lot of NFL hype, everything going into that for him. This is a huge year. This is a contract year, as they call it, for Quinn Ewers. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. Steve Sarkisian is someone who has not made many big missteps as the Texas head coach. He's done really, really incredible things. But for the first time as the Texas head coach, he's under the most pressure that you really can be, where a lot of fans are expecting a national title. A lot of fans are expecting them to win the SEC and, take over from Georgia and do some really remarkable things. And they're capable of doing all of those things. But Steve Sarkisian has not been in a position where he's had to head coach one of those teams, just plain period. He's been at some really good teams, and he's had a lot of success as an OC, and even as a head coach, he's done some really good things, but none of his teams have necessarily been looked at as national title contenders as a head coach. So that's going to be a totally different ballgame for him. It's going to be something that he's going to have to get used to, and hopefully he's able to, thrive under that pressure. But it's one of those things that you can let pressure affect you a number of different ways. If they, crumble under it and they kind of shy away from that moment, they're going to get pushed around in the SEC. I'll just be plain and honest with you. If they, really take advantage of it, really attack it, and are not scared of this challenge, they're going to be more than fine. There's no two ways about that. But also, when you talk about the SEC, the biggest thing that Texas is going to have to adjust to is the schedule, plain and simple. When you talk about making that jump from the Big 12 to the SEC, you're playing two different ball games. And it's not to say that the Big 12 schedule wasn't difficult, because it is. There are games in there that are sketchier than some people might think they are, and Texas struggled in some of those games last year. So when you look at this year, those games are going to be that much tougher. You don't have a game against Iowa State, you have a game against Arkansas. You don't have a game against, Kansas, you have a game against Florida. So things get a little bit more interesting. I'll put it that way. There are definitely a lot more hurdles to get over. And when you talk about Texas, you have 4, 5, 6 weeks stretches that you're going to have to be on your A game every single week if you want to win that game. So there's a lot going into the season. I think when you look at Texas on paper, they have so many talented players on offense. The defense is coming along the way that they hoped it would. A lot of things are in place for this team to be the next team that, maybe takes a little bit of charge in the SEC, maybe wins a couple of titles there, goes to the playoff a ton, and wins a national title. They can do all of those things in the next couple of years. But the reality is, they're going into uncharted territory, and they're going into an area where a lot of teams with a lot of success and a lot of hype have failed before them. So you can be a good team and go 6-6 in the SEC. You can be a great team and go 9-3. Texas wants to be elite. They want to go 11-1. They want to go 12-0. They want to be in Atlanta, and they want to go to the playoff. So all of these things, all of that pressure just continues to build. And from where I'm standing throughout spring, it seems like Steve Sarkisian and company are more than happy to take that pressure and deal with it the way they deal with it, which is play some really good football. So I'm not necessarily super worried about them, especially in year one. When you look at the roster that they have, it's going to be incredible. But the reality is, let's just say they fall on their face in year one. Let's just say it ends up being an 8-4 season, and some of the physicality of the SEC gets to them a little bit, and they're not necessarily the team that we expected coming in. Then things get a little bit interesting around Austin, Texas. Not necessarily, an entire rebuild or anything like that, but the reality is you realize you have to change some things around there to be SEC ready. So overall, are they SEC ready? I would say yes. I would say they're, for the most part, I feel very confident that Texas is going to walk into the SEC and be a big-time player for them. But the reality is, these are uncharted territories. These are pressures that a lot of these players, Steve Sarkisian, Texas as a whole, has not experienced in a very, very long time. So how they deal with that will be incredible to watch. But they're one of those teams that, when you look at preseason rankings, when you look at those, preseason magazines and all of that type of stuff, you're going to look at it and say Texas is, one of the best teams in the country, and you're not wrong by any means. But there are a lot of things that go beyond, the roster and the head coach and the NIL and all of the infrastructure in place that go into winning the SEC. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think they're a team that, they've misstepped one time, I promise you there are going to be a lot of people coming after them very quickly. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about recruiting. A huge weekend this past weekend, and a lot of big-time news coming out of it. We definitely have a ton to cover with a ton of big-time players. So let's waste no more time. Let's take our break right here, and then we'll be back right with that.